Hey everyone, let's see if this is all working. All right. Let's make sure. There we go. All right. Welcome everyone. I'm Jenny Ponzurek, just trying to figure out if all my technology is working today. I will say right before I started this, all of a sudden my computer just kind of froze on me. So that's why I'm having a little hesitation here, making sure everything's working. Whew. Okay. So as I was saying, my name is Jenny Ponzurek. Background in the wonderful world of school psychology, school neuropsychology as well. I am one of the graduates of Dr. Dan Miller's school neuropsychology program. I completed it so long ago. It used to be in person. Nowadays, all of his programs are online. And today I wanted to talk to everyone about some different tips when we're evaluating students for traumatic brain injury. And for those of you who haven't yet seen some of my other tips, we've also done a couple of our other lives talking about tips for evaluating some of our other areas of eligibility as well. So you can always go ahead and check those on out. If you head over to my website, jennyponzurek.com, up in the corner under resources, you'll see some information about social media lives, and you can click there and you can hang out and check out any of our replays. As well, we usually create like a blog post out of them too to highlight those, so you can also go check out the blog post as well. So when we are talking about traumatic brain injury, let's talk about a couple of tips with this. Now, I have to admit, I think one of the huge benefits of participating in the school neuropsychology program is definitely a lot more background information about the brain, about all the different ways that the brain impacts behavior and learning, so that if I had a student who had a traumatic brain injury, I feel like that program really gave me a leg up on understanding immediately what are some things I am already thinking about, some possible things that we want to follow up on. Now, when we're evaluating kids with traumatic brain injury, I think this is definitely such a unique group of students for a variety of different reasons. Number one, for many of these students, they've never been a part of special education. And so one of the things that we find a lot with some of our students with traumatic brain injuries is we see a decline in some of their skills. And in some of these instances, we of course don't have anything other than, report cards and all of those other data sources, but we don't have like standardized tests to like reflect on how they were doing in some of these areas prior to. Whereas sometimes, of course, we have students who are already in special education who have had traumatic brain injuries, after they were placed in special education, maybe for a learning disability or, a language impairment or something like that. And then we see maybe a traumatic brain injury from a car accident or something like that. And in those kind of cases, we have some other data to do a lot of comparison with. So when I think about some different tips here, one of the first tips is really to connect with your school nurse. And if you are the school neuropsych, yay. If you're not a school neuropsych, but there's one in your district, I would definitely consult with them on this case. And I would just share as much information that you have about the medical information. A lot of times when we're talking about a traumatic brain injury, there's a lot of medical information that most of the time, even with my school neuropsych background, I'm still getting my nurse on the phone. I'm still Googling certain things and making sure that I have a full understanding of what exactly happened here. And so I think really connecting with these other professionals can be really helpful in these pieces. I know some of you work at some school districts where maybe you don't always have consistently like a district or a school nurse, or they're super busy human beings. This is definitely a case where I'm going to need some connection with someone who can walk me through this medical piece here. The other thing that's going to be really important, depending on when the traumatic brain injury occurred, is to, of course, get those releases filled out so that you can connect with the medical professionals. And depending on the impact and the aftermath of the traumatic brain injury, if the student's in any sort of hospitalization or cognitive rehab, you want to connect with these people. Again, depending on the all the different circumstances surrounding a traumatic brain injury, many times students are participating in some sort of cognitive rehab. And a lot of times those places are also providing some standardized testing as kind of like a right at the beginning of the process, and then they might repeat some of those things a little bit later on. So of course we never want to administer anything too close in time. So if we know that the student is involved in any sort of outside support to help with some of the recovery, we want to make sure that we're connected with those people so that we don't accidentally give something. The other thing to be thoughtful of course, is when our students are part of any sort of rehab, the timing of all of these different pieces. When we are working with our students with traumatic brain injuries, we may see very different results or a very different performance, much earlier. How do I want to put this? We might see improvements in a much shorter period of time than we are usually used to, right? Traumatic brain injuries for most of us are very few and far between in our evaluations. We, are definitely evaluating a lot more kids for learning disabilities or, social emotional concerns. And so this can be a little bit different for some school psychologists. So I would definitely, these would be like the first people I would connect with. Again, school, district nurse, and I would check to see if you have any school neuropsychs in your district that you can consult with. If not, if you head over to the school neuropsych website, you should also be able to kind of look to see if there's any school neuropsychs in your area. And that might be something that, if you think that would be helpful, could be someone you could connect with as well, or maybe that your district could consult with. The other thing, kind of piggybacking on one of the things that I just mentioned, this is not going to be your typical evaluation. Many of us are just used to using our favorite assessment batteries and just thinking about, all right, I'm getting my whisk out, I'm getting my C-top, I'm getting this out. Now, these may be very appropriate tools to be using with your student. However, it's not our typical evaluation, right? Really understanding where the site of the injury is can be really helpful in figuring out where exactly we might want to be digging a little bit deeper into. So if we have noticed that there is some temporal lobe damage, right side, left side, immediately we have some thoughts about what might be impacted a little bit more. And so we really want to make sure we've done a lot of our background homework before we're just opening up test kits to really get an understanding of what's going to be the most appropriate tools to be using in order to figure out exactly what these students' needs are at this time. Because again, most of our kids, when we're thinking about special education, of course, we're just doing this evaluation, then I'll see you again in 3 years. Sometimes there are kids who have had some interesting type of occurrences with their brain. I'm even thinking, not quite under TBI, but, I had a student who had had a stroke. The recovery for some of these skills and abilities is sometimes just a couple of months later, we might see something very different. So a lot of times when we're evaluating students and determining their goals and determining their needs, writing an IEP for a year from now seems super appropriate. And for the large majority of kids, that's as frequently as we kind of do major check-ins. a lot of times with our kids with traumatic brain injuries, their needs might change a lot more frequently than we are used to. So we want to just be really clear with our team about, if we see that the student, all of a sudden there's some new things that we're noticing, or we're seeing some improvements and this kid does not need this level of service of anymore, that we may be talking about more frequent IEPs than what we are used to. I remember evaluating a student at one point during the school year, and then by the end of the school year, we actually did an updated evaluation, and the student's needs had improved so dramatically that we really were able to pull away most of the services. That is not every single student. That was this particular student. But it was definitely something like I remember the surprise by most of our IEP team members because we're not used to seeing such improvement in that area. Another thing that I thought was really interesting with that case as well is that whole piece with special ed versus how the student was previously performing versus, general ed expectations. We have all these different ways that we kind of compare how our students are progressing. And I remember being so excited that the student had progressed so well, that the student was actually kind of meeting grade level expectations. And I remember being at that meeting and we were all sharing how wonderful we thought all of this progress was. And I remember the parent and the student being at that meeting, and not that they weren't happy with the progress, but they were used to the student excelling, not just meeting. So it was kind of a different conversation than we were used to, right? Usually we're at meetings and we're like, you're meeting grade level standards, like you're ready to exit, like yay. And the student wasn't yet at the yay part, and neither was the parent. So it was a very interesting conversation to talk about, like, well, where are these excuse me, when is, it's special ed versus just general ed role, like where are all of our different roles? And we kind of had to have a really big conversation about that piece as well. So I think when we are doing the evaluations and gathering all this information, really determining the student's needs is really, again, being thoughtful about the timeline for checking in on how the students are progressing, or are we noticing some differences in things as well. And that kind of leads me to our third tip here, which is really thinking about executive functioning. Now, I know for some of you, we think about executive functioning, you got a lot of different thoughts and different assessment tools, and you love this rating scale. And for some of us in this field, we just haven't had as much exposure to that. Maybe it's not a term that's used really frequently at your school. You don't have a lot of parents talking about that. So one of the resources I do want to share that's free for everyone is last year, and we're trickling a little bit, finishing them up this year as well. We started doing a lot of blog posts about different executive skills. So if you've not checked out my blog post on my website, jennyponzarek.com, at the top under resources, you'll see where it says blog. And you can check that out. We actually have an entire category just for executive functioning. So if you've not taken a look on there, we have some information about different executive skills. And then for most of them, we usually have a little free handout that goes with it too. So something you can keep on file for yourself. But a lot of times when kids have had traumatic brain injuries, depending again on the site of the injury, a lot of times when we think about a lot of the different executive skills for children and for adults, a lot of that is up in the frontal lobe region. So when we think about a lot of car accidents or a lot of brain injuries, a lot of times, even if the initial impact was not on the frontal lobe, the impact maybe was in the back of the head, because the brain is then crashing into the front of the head, a lot of times that frontal lobe ends up being impacted to some degree. So one of the things to be thoughtful of is if executive functioning is not one of your everyday kind of areas that you tend to examine with your evaluations, I would definitely kind of put that on the list. See what kind of executive functioning, maybe formal skills that your district has. For those of you who have never taken a look at, there's so many different amazing books out there about executive functioning. I really love a lot of the informal questionnaires as well that are in Peg Dawson and Richard Guar's books. They have a whole series of books about executive functioning. They're the authors of the Smart but Scattered series, and they have that for kids and teens, and they actually have it for kids transitioning out into the world. They have a book for support for adults with executive functioning difficulties, but they have a book specifically for practitioners like you and I. And in the back of that book, and I think it's called Executive Skills for Children and Adolescents, just go on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, Peg Dawson, Richard Guar, Executive Functioning. You're going to see a whole bunch of books pop up. In the back of their book, they have a number of executive functioning questionnaires. And I have to say that I use a lot of those questionnaires, even just informally, in a lot of my evaluations. Like even when I'm looking at learning disabilities, it's just a really nice informal way to gather some information from students. I use it almost as a part of my student interview process, of just because it's a very friendly way, because it shows that like everyone has strengths and weaknesses in relation to all these different executive skills. So if you've never checked that out, I would highly encourage you to do so. It's one of my favorite resources. So if your district doesn't have a formal executive functioning rating scale, that can be an informal one that gives you a lot of great information as well. But the other thing to be thoughtful of in regards to executive functioning is that our executive functioning skills, quite a few of them, depending on which book you're reading, which article you're reading, which website you go to, sometimes there's 3 executive skills, sometimes there's 5, sometimes there's 12 or 13, sometimes there's 30 plus, right? So some of our executive skills are really kind of present more at like the beginning stages of our educational career, right? When we think of like response inhibition, right? Like don't touch that type of thing. Those are things obviously we're practicing with our kindergartners, right? And our first graders. We would not expect students in first grade to have certain executive skills, like they're still working on fluid reasoning. They're still working on reflection skills and thinking about your thinking skills or metacognition. There are certain executive skills that continue to grow and develop up until your later 20s, early 30s. And I bring this up because if you have students who have had a traumatic brain injury and we still are seeing some after effects, depending where they are in their development, you may not like right away see some of the impacts, because we wouldn't have that expectation that students at that age level would even have that skill yet. And so, for example, things like fluid reasoning. Fluid reasoning is something that we don't ask a lot of our first graders to even apply a lot of fluid reasoning skills, right? You don't need a lot of fluid reasoning to learn how to like blend and segment sounds or to add and subtract numbers, right? That really comes into play a little bit later on in elementary school. So if you have a student who unfortunately had like a traumatic brain injury when they were younger, you might not see those after effects of that traumatic brain injury on some of those skills until later on. So again, this is why, I mentioned like, this is not our typical like SLD evaluation where we're just coming in and we kind of expect like, these were your areas of strength, these were your difficulties. We're probably going to see similar types of things 3 years from now. We might see some different things. So I find that with students who unfortunately have had traumatic brain injuries that we really need to monitor them a little bit more closely. We monitor all of our students. I know that. But especially when we think about we might need to check in, their needs might change a little bit more dramatically than our typical student in special education. I guess that's the way I want to put it. So I would really, again, if that's not something that you are used to taking a look at for a lot of your evaluations, if you have a student who has had a traumatic brain injury, that would be something I would be thinking about a little bit more. Again, if you go to my website, you go to our blog post, we have a number of blog posts about this topic around executive functioning. Oh good, that didn't show up at all. Excellent. Did I mention my technology is being a little particular today? Did I not mention that at the beginning when I started? Oh my goodness, I thought I was gonna have to restart my whole computer at one point. Okay, so what I wanted to share was, If you go to my website, jennypunzurek.com, in addition to a lot of free resources that I have, if you just click on the resources button, there's a lot of free resources that I have there. If you look under our consultation button, we also have a community that we call our Prepared School Psych community. That's what that last slide was supposed to say. For some reason, it does not. And our Prepared School Site community, what we've done this year is we have created a document for each of our areas of eligibility. We are kind of rolling one out every single month. So last month in February, we rolled out our document for traumatic brain injury. Now, we already have one document in there for each of our areas of eligibility. We're actually this year adding a second document. And the second document, we refer to them as our RIOT documents: review of records, interview, observe, and test. And what it does is it kind of takes a look at what kind of questions should I be asking in an interview? Because I don't look at traumatic brain injury all the time. What are some different questions? What might I be looking for in an observation if we're considering a TBI versus, like a learning disability? And traumatic brain injuries are a little bit different than a lot of our areas of eligibility, because I'm not usually the one who's like saying this kid has had a traumatic brain injury. Usually someone's telling me, like a doctor, right? The parent walked in, they had a traumatic brain injury, right? So for us, our responsibility in these areas is a little bit different than like a learning disability, where I feel like our evaluation process is really identifying that they meet the criteria. Most of the time we're like, nope, they have had a traumatic brain injury. Our role and responsibility now is really, what is the educational impact, and is there a need for special education and related services? So what we did inside our Prepared School Site community is for traumatic brain injury, as well as many of our other areas of eligibility. And by the end of the school year, we will have that RIOT document in for all of our areas of eligibility, to really provide that support for people where this might be the first time you've ever had to really examine this area of eligibility. What are some considerations for all the different, avenues of collecting data, so that we feel prepared for that IEP meeting. So if you've not checked out our community, the Prepared School Site community, I'd invite you to check it out. And as always, if anyone has any questions about our community or how to find any of the resources that I was just talking about, if you go to my website, jennypunzurek.com, and if you scroll right on down on that front page, there's a place to go ahead and ask me questions. So feel free to fill that out at any time. There's also down there a place for you to sign up for my newsletter. And so we like to share with you different free resources that we've either created ourselves or stumbled upon, free webinars and different things like that. So if any of those things might intrigue you, feel free to sign up for our newsletter while you're on the website. All right. I want to thank everyone who decided to join me live, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and good luck out there. I know we're in that March mania, March Madness, whatever you want to call it. Good luck, and as always, reach out if you have any questions. All right. Bye, everyone.